of the board of the Friends. Normally, Alice, our president of the library, would be here to greet you, but she's stuck in Chicago. The weather apparently has been terrible in the Midwest, so she can't be with us tonight. But I do want to be sure and encourage you to check the website for the library. There is a lot going on this summer. One of the things that you might find interesting is this reading bingo. So that might be fun for you to check out. There's papers on the registration table on your way out. But do check the website for other things. The purpose of the Friends is to support the library and its programs, which we do financially and which you are doing tonight by being here. The Friends, just to let you know, have some programs of their own that they run. One of them is the nation's first Books for Babies. We provide a book to every baby that is born in Stanford Hospital. And we also have a competition, a literary competition for young people in the city of Stanford from 3rd grade through high school. They are invited to submit poetry, fiction, nonfiction, and then those submissions are judged, and we have a huge celebration afterwards to recognize those children that have received special recognition for their work. So there's some really interesting things going on, and I would encourage you, if you think that this is worthwhile, to consider becoming a friend of Ferguson Library. There are flyers for that also on the registration table. So tonight, I have the great pleasure of introducing to you our speaker for tonight, Fiona Davis. She is a New York Times bestseller author of 7 historical fiction novels, as you know. I'm sure many of you had read many of them. And each of them is set in an iconic New York City building. Her works have been chosen for the Good Morning America Book Club pick and as a One Book, One Community read. Her articles have also appeared in the Wall Street Journal and the Oprah magazine, and her books have been translated into over 20 languages. In addition to her professional life, Ms. Davis is active in civic life. She has sat on the boards of Columbia School of Journalism and the Manhattan Theater Club, and she has also organized bi-weekly Zoom meetings for women with Parkinson's disease in the New York City metropolitan area. Tonight, Ms. Davis is going to introduce us to her latest novel, The Spectacular, which is set in Radio City Music Hall. Please welcome Fiona Davis.
Thank you, Mary. That was a lovely introduction. I appreciate it. And Books for Babies. Oh my goodness. All right, so my publicist asks, if you don't mind, if I take a video of everybody holding up your book. You know that shot that everybody does on Instagram? They make me do it under pain of death. All right, are we ready? Here we go. Beautiful. I love it. Can you hold a Kindle? That's fantastic. Oh, all right. Well, I thought today I'd tell you a little bit about myself and then kind of go into the research and inspiration behind my book, The Spectacular. Let's see if I have this right. Oh, there we go. Yeah, so I never imagined that I would be a writer. I thought that was for other people. I love to read, but I couldn't imagine writing a book that was over 300 pages. That seemed insane. And so after college, I actually moved to New York and worked as an actress for about 10 years. And it was so much fun. I fell in with a group that we created a theater company, and I did Broadway and off-Broadway and regional theater. If you saw a production of Three Tall Women, that was me. And it was really, really a wonderful time. And with this theater company, we really collaborated together. So you did everything. You swept the stage, you hung the lights, we got the costumes from thrift stores when we had to. And one of our shows went from off Broadway to Broadway in a single season and was nominated for a Tony Award, which was very cool. We lost to Liam Neeson. I'm not bitter. But it was really, really wonderful. And I found that as I started getting into my late 20s, all my friends who were women who were a little older were having a hard time finding jobs. And I noticed that all my male friends were aging into these really great character roles. And I thought, well, that's not fair. You know, what else do I want to do? And this was before the internet, so you couldn't ask the internet, what should I do next? And so I remember I went to NYU, and they had this career services department, and they had me take a Briggs-Myers test. And so I took the test, and it told me that I should be a journalist or a policeman. And I just thought, I can't possibly be a policeman, so I guess I'll be a journalist. And so I applied to Columbia School of Journalism and got in, and that was amazing. It was a year-long program. It was really intense. And I learned so much there about how to shape a story, you know, how to go out and interview people who you've never met. The very first day, they give you an assignment, and they tell you to go out onto Broadway and 116th and find someone to interview as a source and come back, write the story, and turn it in an hour. And you're just panicked at the thought of approaching someone on the street. But it was so helpful for what I do now, where I like to do a ton of research and really reach out to so many people. And so I no longer have that fear. You know, you actually learn that people love to talk about themselves. And so that helped as well. And then after I graduated, I did a lot of freelancing. I wrote for Oprah, I wrote for Women's Health. It was the kind of thing where if you needed like a 300-word article on heartburn, I was your girl. And it was interesting, but it wasn't, you know, quite as fulfilling as I thought I wanted it to be. And I remember one day, I was looking for an apartment in New York City, and my broker took me to the Barbizon 63 condo. And I knew it had been the Barbizon Hotel for women. And I knew it was this very, you know, lush hotel for cultured young ladies to stay in while they worked or studied in New York City in the 40s, 50s, 60s. But I realized that I learned that when it went condo in 2005, there were a dozen of the old-time residents still living there. And they were moved into fourth-floor studio apartments with kitchenettes. So they paid, you know, $200 a month. And then the guy in the penthouse paid $17 million. And my journalist brain kind of, you know, turned on and said, okay, this would be a great story. This shows how, you know, if we could interview these women, it could show how the city has changed over time, how the building has changed over time, and how its residents have changed over time. But at that time, the women of the fourth floor were very private, and they would not be interviewed. And I just couldn't shake it. And I started thinking, God, I'd love to read a book about this. You know, you could have a journalist in modern times, and you could have someone in the 50s, you know, living in the hotel. And I started thinking, well, maybe I should try and write that book just to scratch that itch. And so that's what I did. I really learned everything I could about how you write a book, because fiction is so different from nonfiction. The thought of just making up dialogue is really terrifying when you're told you can't do that. And so I really kind of played around with it over a number of years, and that ended up becoming my first book, The Dollhouse. And that's really where it came from. And I remember as it was coming along, I started to know some of the ladies on the fourth floor after it was kind of almost published. And one of them actually came to the launch party, which was great because she was about that tall, and she had hair up to here, and she just walked in, and the room just parted. You know, she was the superstar of the night. And so that was really wonderful. And so each book for me has come about in a different way. You know, for the Dakota, which is the setting of my next book, everyone says, you know, did you plan on doing books about residences? And I really didn't. I did the book about the dollhouse, and then that hadn't even been published when I started thinking, well, where else do I want to set a book? And I was walking by the Dakota one day, right on Central Park West there, and it was glowing in the sunlight, you know, like it was saying, pick me. And I thought, oh, that would be a fun place to snoop around in. But I had a huge problem in that I didn't know anyone who lived there. And it's not like they let you in. Fair enough. And so a good friend of mine who's a real estate agent, she said, you know, Lauren Bacall's apartment is on the market for $23 million. Let's go. So I threw a scarf around my neck, and we got this amazing tour of Lauren Bacall's apartment. And it was just incredible because all the period detail was still there. It was an estate sale. She died a few years earlier. But you could walk around, and I was wandering around looking at everything and trying to memorize the fireplace and the molding and asking questions like, is there a gym? You know? And I did not buy that apartment. But it was really a wonderful way to get inside. And later I did get to know a couple people who lived in the building and got a full tour from the basement all the way up to the top floor where the maids used to live, and learned all about the ghosts of the place. And so from then on, I was kind of hit the ground running on, okay, this is what I do. I write books about buildings. And this book came about in a very particular way, in that I'd finished the Magnolia Palace, which is set at the Frick. And I got this email through my author website. And I hadn't picked a building. People say, do you have a folder full of buildings? And I don't. I really kind of wing it as it comes along. And I got this email, and it said, my name's Sandy. I'm in my mid-80s, and I'm a former Rockette. And if you want to know the secrets of Radio City Music Hall, you should call me. And so, of course, I had to, right? And we had this amazing conversation. And it turns out she danced there 59 to 62. There she is. And she was 19. She met her husband, Bob, there. He worked the lighting board. He was 19 as well. They've been married ever since. And she was just, her memories were so vivid and so strong. And she just talked about what a great experience this was. And, you know, how this really started her life in such a positive way as an adult. And she had a great time doing that. And then, you know, eventually left after a few years and married and started having kids. And what was so nice is on the very first stop of my book tour for this book, it's been out for a couple weeks now, I was down in New Jersey where she just moved to. And so she came with her husband and her son. And so we met for real life the first time. And as in the end, I was signing books, and I looked over, and they'd set up a table for her, and she was signing away as well. I wish I could take her wherever we went. It was really quite something. But she had saved a lot of archival things for me. So she had programs and schedules, and that's so helpful. She shipped it all up to me by FedEx. And so I could go through it and really get a sense of what it was like to be a Rockette, because that's what you want. You want to really ground the reader in the facts. But I was really daunted about writing about Radio City Music Hall because I am not a dancer. I joke around that I have the flexibility of an 80-year-old man. And so this was not something that I could easily translate into words. And so I did what I always do, is I really jumped into the history. And I learned that the Rockettes were formed in 1925 in St. Louis, of all places. They were known as the Missouri Rockets. And they were created by a guy named Russell Markert, who got 16 girls together. At that time, the height requirement was 5'2" to 5'6.5". Today, it's 5'5" to 5'10.5", which shows you how things have changed. And so he hired these girls, and they were this precision dance troupe. And they did very well, and they were asked to go to Broadway, where they caught the eye of a man named S.L. Rothafel, who's known as Roxy. Come on, Bessie. There we go. And he was this theatrical impresario, and he'd had all these film picture places all around America because films were so popular then. And he thought the Rockettes were great, and so he took them under his wing and renamed them the Roxyettes. And he hired them to work at Radio City Music Hall's opening night in 1932. And there were over 6,000 people there, and it was a complete debacle. It was pouring rain. There were so many acts. There were the Roxyettes, the Flying Walendas, Martha Graham. It went on until 2:30 in the morning. And Roxy finally had to be hospitalized for stress. However, you know, Radio City opened, and at that point, the Roxyettes were renamed the Rockettes, and they were hired to dance in between the movies. Now today, Radio City is very different. It's a concert venue, right? Or you see comedians or award shows. But back then, it was a film forum, and they did 4 shows a day. And if you bought a ticket to the movie, you could get a ticket to the stage show. And that went along with the theme of the movie. So say that it was a John Wayne movie, the Rockettes would do a cowboy number with hats and holsters. And they had not only the Rockettes, they had the Radio City Ballet Corps. They had a choral ensemble. Sometimes they'd have a juggler. And so you'd come see the movie, you'd see the show, and it would be this whole really wonderful afternoon. And they did 4 shows a day, so that's what their schedule was. And there were 46 girls, and 36 worked at any one time. Here's a shot of the Roxyettes, which is quite something. And that's Radio City, and me pointing at it. And here are the Rockettes. I think that's from the 1940s. And so at that point, there were 46 girls, 36 worked at any one time. And the schedule was really tough. You did 4 shows a day, and you did that for 3 or 4 weeks straight. And then you got a week off. And then you'd start the cycle all over again. And if it was a premiere day, you would have worked on the rehearsals for the new show in between the other ones, or late at night or early in the morning. And then on premiere day, you would have to get there at 5 a.m. You'd have a 7 a.m. dress rehearsal. Then you'd have a photo call, and then you'd go off and do your 4 shows. And there was a kick line in every number, so they did around 600 kicks per day. You imagine what their core was like. It was quite something. And the pay in the late 50s, which is when my book was set, started around $70 a week, which was considered really good. And so the theater itself, of course, I've been talking about this around the country, and a lot of people don't know it, but here I think, most people really know the theater, and it's so beautiful. You can see that it's kind of shaped like an oval. It's enormous. It's all unobstructed views. And you see those cascading arches that are in kind of red and orange and yellow. And that was made to mimic a sunrise that Roxy saw on a transatlantic cruise. That was his idea. And he also hired Donald Deskey to do the interior design inside, and that's, of course, all Art Deco, which is just stunning. The details are incredible. And in the book, I try to differentiate Radio City from the Broadway shows, because a lot of people have come to New York, they've seen the Broadway shows, and those theaters are different. And so in my book, I wrote, the Broadway shows are like hoop-skirted maidens from the last century, overly ornamented and full of froth, with flamboyant chandeliers and Rococo plasterwork. In contrast, Radio City resembled a jazz-age siren wearing a silk slip, sleek and elegant. And so you had this beautiful theater and all these people working in it. And so all around that, there was this kind of little city was built up. And there's 7 floors that kind of go up around the theater. And there you had a cafeteria, you had a 26-bed dormitory for when they had to sleep over. They had a lounge and a library. There was a little screening room for premieres. You had a poster department, a tailor, a shoe and hat department, a medical department with a trained nurse on staff all the time. And then up on the roof, they had shuffleboard and wiffle ball courts so that the dancers would come up in between shows and kind of hang out up there, much to the delight of the men working in the skyscrapers. It really was this wonderful community. And then in terms of the research, I interviewed a lot of Rockettes, some who danced there in the 40s, 50s, 60s, and more modern times. And they all spoke, here's some shots of them, they all spoke with such joy about their time. I think especially in the 40s and 50s, it was a time when women were supposed to be wives or teachers or nurses. And here were these women working in the middle of New York City, making their own money, fiercely independent. I talked to one, and she described her favorite memory was walking down the middle of Fifth Avenue in the middle of the night, arm in arm with her fellow Rockettes, singing at the top of their lungs. It gets me teary every time I say that. There's just something about that sense of freedom and joy when women weren't really allowed to have that. And, I would ask them, I'd say, okay, is there any, what's the real dirt? Was there backstabbing backstage? And they said no. Everyone was so pleased to be there. And under Russell Marker, who was sounds like this wonderful guy, he stayed on until 1971 when he retired as the director and choreographer. And he was a real father figure. And I think because of him, it was a very positive, safe experience for these generations of women who passed through. And I learned a lot of fun, interesting things, like you weren't allowed to get a tan or a sunburn. You couldn't change your weight. You couldn't change your hair color. I learned that there was a conductor in the 40s that the last show of the night, he'd speed up so he could make his train home. And so they'd have to dance faster and faster and faster. I learned that, you know, that the toy soldiers thing that they do at Christmas, that in the 40s, those pants were so starched that you'd have to climb into a chair and slide in. It was just terrific. We're getting some mood. Wow, getting some mood lighting. I'm not sure if they meant to do that. Oh, they did. Okay, you can see me? That's what's, okay. I also got a great backstage tour of the place. Here's the Roxy apartment, which is not an apartment. Roxy made it as a place to entertain people who were visiting. And so people like Judy Garland or Walt Disney would come up. They'd sign the guest book, which is still there and really incredible. And it's beautiful. It's got these gold-plated ceilings that are 20 feet high, these cherry-paneled walls, just a really beautiful example of Art Deco. The picture doesn't really do it justice. And I found fun things like this in the New York Times. I don't know if you can read that, but they had this article in 1967 about Miss Average Rockette that described the typical topography of all things, with all these total of 12 measurements, thigh, calf, weight, which is a little creepy, but kind of shows the obsession with these girls. And I also learned so much of it was about illusion. That, you know how they all look like in the kick line, that they're all the same height? Well, what they do is they put the taller ones in the middle and the shorter ones at the end, and then they make the hemlines all equal. And it gives you the illusion of that. I also learned that, you know, when they do that kick line, it looks like they're all holding on to each other and kicking. But in fact, they're not. There's a few inches of space in between the hand of the girl and the back of the girl next to her. And my guess is that's so if one wobbles, it doesn't bring down the whole line. But it was very interesting learning these tricks. And that's what I'm looking for as an author, is I'm looking for these little details that kind of, you know, solidify what I'm talking about and drop the reader into the story in a way that works better than if I described a room for 3 pages, which absolutely no one wants. One of the places I learned about was the Rehearsal Club. And that was this boarding house on 53rd Street, so right around the corner from Radio City, where a lot of Rockettes stayed. And it was a boarding house for young girls who were pursuing a career in the performing arts. And there were a lot of rules. There was no smoking, no drinking, no boys above the parlor. There was a midnight curfew. And you had to be between 18 and 25 and neither married nor divorced. And you had to be seeking a career in the performing arts, either taking classes or performing or auditioning. And in the 1950s, it was about $18 a week, and that included room and board. That was 2 meals a day during the week. And it was just a place where women could stay that could be safe, because it was very hard to get an apartment as a single girl. You were considered a little, you know, shady. And so this was a place where they could go and be safe. If you saw the movie Stage Door, that's based on this location. And some of the famous people who lived there included Carol Burnett, Blythe Danner, Diane Keaton, Sandy Duncan. And you can just imagine what it was like to be roommates with Carol Burnett. And in fact, just recently, the podcast, Julia Louis-Dreyfus does this new podcast, and she interviews Carol Burnett. And Carol Burnett talks about her time there and how wonderful it was. And she says, you know, at one point, she just didn't know what to do. She wasn't getting any jobs. She didn't have an agent. And so she pulled together all her friends and roommates from the Rehearsal Club, and they put on a show at the Rehearsal Club and invited every agent they knew, and that's how she got representation. And if you Google Carol Burnett and the Rehearsal Club, you'll see a great shot of her jumping on a bed, which is really funny. It would be just so much fun to be roommates with her. And so in my book, there's a character named Marion, and she lives in Bronxville with her father and her sister, and she's a dance teacher, and she very much wants to be a Rockette, but her father disapproves of that. And Marion is based on an actress named Vera Ellen. And she was a famous film actress, but before she did that, she was a Rockette. And she was hired by Russell Markert, but she had a really hard time fitting in because she was just bursting with creativity. So if he wanted a kick that was shoulder height, hers were eye height, right? If he wanted, the arms extended this far, hers were that far. And she just could never kind of pull it back. And finally, he gave her a couple weeks to get it together, and she quit before she was fired. And then she eventually found, this wonderful film career. She was in White Christmas and a number of other movies. But it just struck me how interesting that was, this conundrum of needing to fit into something but being too much for it. And that really goes to the theme of the book, which is, what is the cost of suppressing your own individuality or your own creativity for the good of the greater whole? And that's whether you're in a precision dance troupe or in a corporation or a community. When do you work together as a team? And then when do you have to stop and make your voice heard? And so that theme kind of runs throughout the book, you'll see. And in all of my books, I do a lot of research into the time period so that I can ground the story in something that's actually happening in New York. So for The Lions of Fifth Avenue, set at the New York Public Library, it was the Heterodoxy Club, which was this downtown club for women. And for the Chelsea Girls, it was the Red Scare. And as I was doing research for this book, I learned that at the end of 1956, the police were on this huge hunt for this guy named the Mad Bomber. In my book, I call him the Big Apple Bomber. I changed a couple of the details, but I explain it very clearly in the author's note what kind of is fact and fiction. Most of it is fact. There was this guy who over 16 years set 33 bombs throughout New York City in iconic buildings like the New York Public Library, Penn Station. He set 2 at Radio City Music Hall. He injured 15 people, some seriously, and the police just could not find him. And finally, desperate, they turned to this psychiatrist named James Russell, and he worked at Creedmoor State Hospital in Queens. And they gave him all the letters that the bomber had sent them over the years. And he studied them very closely, and he came up with a profile of the guy. And he said to the police, he'll be between 40 and 50 years old, clean shaven, very well dressed. He won't be married. He'll be living with an older female relative. He'll be from Eastern Europe. He'll be Roman Catholic. He had all of these details. And finally he said, when you find him, he'll be wearing a double-breasted suit and it will be buttoned. Now, I won't give anything away, but needless to say that the science of criminal profiling was born from this guy. And it was so fascinating to learn that because it's something that we, of course, take for granted. Every show we see, right, has some kind of criminal profiling. And this was the very first time. And so in my book, I thought, well, that's fascinating. What if we had this, young girl who's trying to work as a rockette, and what if we turned it into a bit of a thriller? So you still get all the backstage glamour, you still get all the glitz of New York in the 50s. And then she teams up with a very introverted but very brilliant psychiatrist who in my book is named Peter. And together, for very personal reasons, she has to track down this bomber. And together they kind of set off on this deadly adventure. And so it's got a bit of mystery, a bit of romance, a bit of glamour, and a touch of thriller, which was a lot of fun to work on. And one thing that's very lightly peppered in this book is something that's very personal to me. And that is in August of 2020, my book came out, The Lions of Fifth Avenue, and I learned one day that it had hit the New York Times bestseller list, which was very exciting. And then the very next day, I went to the doctor because whenever I held my phone, my hand would go like this. And I thought, well, that's strange. So the very next day after getting that great news, I went to the doctor and was told I had Parkinson's. And I was so shocked because I thought, well, I'm far too young, but it turns out I'm not. And, it strikes 1 million people in America. And so I did what I normally do is I threw myself into research and I learned as much as I could about it. And I talked to people who had it. And so many of them said to me, I don't tell anyone. I didn't even tell my adult children because I don't want anyone to think I'm old or I don't want to lose my job, which are absolutely, reasons, that very valid. And it started me thinking, that reminds me so much of breast cancer 30 or 40 years ago, right, where no one spoke of it. And yet here we have 1 million people who have it. It's the most common neurodegenerative disease after Alzheimer's. And it made me think, well, maybe I'll explore it a little bit in this book because I think that's a reason for the arts is to, work through stuff. And that's whether you write poetry or you sing badly in the shower. It's so important to have an outlet. And, my hope is by kind of saying, yep, I have it, this is what it looks like, we can encourage more people to step up and say that as well. And because, of course, there's power in numbers. And the more funding and the more research. And, of course, there's so much going on right now with Michael J. Fox and some incredible breakthroughs. So I almost feel like if now's the time to get Parkinson's, I'll take it. There's so much going on. And so that's kind of peppered very lightly throughout the book. But really the book kind of dives into all the things that I'm most interested in. And those are how women's voices and agency have changed over time, the importance of the arts in our lives, and then just finding these hidden stories that are tucked beneath New York's historic timeline. Thank you. Thank you. Thanks. And now, we'll see if we can turn up the lights, if that's okay. I think they're working on that, just so we're not in a... And then there's a microphone that they're going to pass around for questions, just because they need that for the recording. So here it comes. Does anyone have any questions? And I'm happy to talk about this book, any of the other books, writing in general, books in general. Who's going to be the first? Yeah, up at the front here. Thank you. Oh, now we've got the groovy disco lighting. Wow. Okay, here we go. Hey, nice to see everybody. Wow. Okay. All right, we'll go with it. So yes, your question.
So it's kind of a twofold question. The
Sure.
first question would be, can you let us in possibly on what the next New York building is? And then the second question, I just finished reading The Address and I loved it because I love the Gilded Age. And I'm one of those people that always wish I lived 100 or 120 years ago.
Yes.
If you had to choose a character or time in all of your books that you've written that you would most want to live, what time would that be?
Oh, that's a good one. Well, I'll start with the second one. I love the Gilded Age as well. I think it's such a dynamic time. For me, I'd love to live in the 20s, I think, in New York City, because there was such a crazy freedom, that people after the Spanish flu and after the war, there was such this, feeling of release and excitement. So I think I'd be interested to see what the city was like then. And the next book is actually in the works. I'm working on it now. It's set at the Met Museum. Yeah, oh, good. And it's going to be kind of two timelines, 1930s from the point of view of an Egyptologist, and then 40 years later in 1970, where she's working at the Met. And then she'll also be having to be teamed up with an assistant for the Met Gala, which is, as you know, the party of the year. And so I like to say it's a mix of glamour and mummies. And we'll see where it goes. Yes, there's a question here.
What satisfies you about writing?
Wow, the voice of God. What satisfies me about writing? I am one of those people who, I love a to-do list. I love checking things off. And so when you're working on a book, it's this huge project that every day you make a little, just a little bit further, another 1,000 words, another 500 words. And if you do that enough, you have a first draft. And so for me, it's the shock that, okay, I have an idea for the book at the Met, and to think that in a year and a half, I'll have a book in my hand. It almost feels like magic, but it's not. It's hard work, but it's just doing a little bit every day, either research or writing or editing. And what most satisfies me about writing is editing, I think. First drafts are hard, but once I have those words on a page, I love rearranging them. And so they finally click into place, and you get that really feeling of, oh, yes, that's what it should be. And so that's my favorite part. Yes, there's a couple over here. We'll get you guys next. Mm-hmm.
Well, before your first book, you needed to get the attention of someone who could make it happen for you. Can you speak a little bit about that, how you did that, and your agent and things like that?
Yeah, the process of, in nonfiction, there's no crossover. I didn't know anyone, who worked in the fiction world. And so it was tough, but I really worked on the manuscript. And then I started going out to panels or conferences where I could hear other writers talk and hear people in the industry talk, like agents and editors, and get to know what I didn't know, which was so much. And at one conference, I heard an agent talk saying, and I really liked what she was saying. And she said she was looking for strong female characters. And so when the Dollhouse was ready, I sent the manuscript to her and said, you know, I heard you speak here. This is what you were looking for. This is what my book's about. And I think that was just enough to get me out of the slush pile. And so she read it and she liked it. And I think the writing needed work. I didn't know what I didn't know, but she loved the concept. And so she brought me on and we worked together for about 1.5 years to really get it into shape before she turned it into editors and then we were off into publication. But that was the first step, was just finding out who's who and reaching out, but very carefully and very politely. Yes, there were some questions over here, I think.
So just regarding the Met, did you get to go to the Met Gala for research? Of course.
No, I wasn't invited this year. I don't think they knew that I was writing the
Not
book,
yet,
because I'm sure
not
that was the reason.
Actually, my question is, as a writer, as a reader, because you're passionate about reading, what did you love to read as a kid? Did you have a favorite book as a kid?
Yeah, my favorite book as a kid was The Secret Garden. I love that book. There's something about the transformation of the main character from this sickly, spoiled child to this, you know, sturdy, strong young kid. Just, oh, I loved it. To the point where I'd go out if it was raining or cold, just to go and experience, you know, what it must be like on the moors. I just wanted to be her so badly. There's one right behind you, yeah.
Hi. I just wanted to say that this is like kind of, sorry, like a comment. My uncle recently is diagnosed with Parkinson's and dementia, and my grandfather also has dementia right now. And my grandpa is the reason he's still living. He's 94, but it's been a really long struggle. So hearing you say that, like you have an outlet for writing is like really inspiring to someone young who's dealing with family members that also have that, because like you feel alone in a sense, and a lot of people feel alone when they are struggling. Sorry, I'm really nervous. Yeah, I know it's not a question and I apologize, but I just wanted to say that you're a really big inspiration to people that may be going through something. And I work in healthcare. I work with patients with dementia and Parkinson's every day. So I work in a nursing home, and I do the work that I do because of people that like you, that I hear stories like that really inspire me. And it's really, really amazing to listen to you today, because I think everyone needs to hear a story like yours. And yeah, so it's, sorry, I'm like babbling.
Thank you.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that, and I don't want to like overwhelm you or anything. I just wanted to say that it's really like amazing to hear that, because it makes me feel like less alone and stuff. My question, sorry, who inspired you to want to write?
Yeah.
Because I want to write one day like my story, and I want to tell my story, and I think that it's important for people to hear from you, especially, you know, like just like people to hear that they should be writing about, you know, things like, you know, that are important.
Absolutely.
I don't know.
Thank you so much for your comment.
Yeah.
And I'm so sorry for what you're going through. And
Yeah.
thank you for everything you do in your job. I can only imagine what it's like having that both at work and with your family. So my heart just goes out to you. And yeah, you know, I think it's so great to have something to work on. And for me, I think the most important advice I'd give about if you wanted to write a book is don't rush it. You know, I didn't publish my first book until I was 49. And it's, you know, it was fine. And I've met all these other writers who had other careers before they wrote. You know, they were lawyers or worked in business. And now we're all these writers, and we're so excited because it's such a joy to do, and we feel very privileged. And so we formed this whole kind of gang of writers over 40. And so it's a really wonderful community to be part of. And I think I couldn't have written any of my books when I was younger just because I didn't have any life experience. And you really need to go through something in order to be able to put it on the page or paint it or create a song. So just stick with it. Anyone else? I think we had one. Da-da-da. Oh, there's one here. Oh, hold on, just hold on for the mic because I think they're taping it.
Thank you. How do you come up with titles for your books?
Yeah, I'm terrible at them. I tend to not do it. Or what will happen is my agent, my editor will say, okay, it's time to figure out the title. And I'll come up with really bad ones because I just can't do it. Because all my titles have to refer to not only the building, but also the plot or the characters. And so it's really tough to do. In fact, sometimes I kind of hardwire it where for the Lions of Fifth Avenue, my editor came up with that one. And so I changed the name of the family who live in the library to the Lions, Lyons. And so the title would work for both. So it's really hard. Magnolia Palace is the only one that I came up with. I'm very proud of it. And if anyone has any titles for the Met book, I'll take them. Thanks. Thanks, Mimi. Great. Oh, yeah, why don't we do 1 and 2, and then we'll...
Along with coming up with the titles, how do you come up with the cover?
Yeah, the cover is interesting because it's the art department at Dutton, who's my publisher, and they're great. And Christopher Lynn's been with me from the very beginning. He now runs the art department. But he came up with that very first cover for the dollhouse, which was so perfect of the girls striding along. And so it's interesting because, my books are in a particular time period. So the only one that was tricky, most of these have just hit it out of the park right away. The only one that was really tricky was the one for the address, which was set at the Dakota. Because you had the Dakota in the background, beautiful. You had Bow Bridge from Central Park, beautiful. You had a woman holding luggage, right? So that told the story. Okay, we've got that. But the very first iteration, keep in mind the book is set in 1880s and 1980s, and the first one had a girl in like 1940s pants, and like Katharine Hepburn-y, and I said to my agent, it's not quite right. I love everything, but let's rework the character. And so the next one they sent back was a pioneer girl with a bonnet, and I was like, no, this won't do. And my agent said to me, well, maybe we don't need an image. Maybe it should just be the building and the bridge and the luggage. And I said, no, it'll look like she jumped. And so I sent a bunch of silhouettes of, Gilded Age, and they finally got one that was exactly right. So it's a bit of a struggle sometimes, but we've always landed on something that I've really adored. And I think one last question here.
Yeah, I think 2 questions. I know most of your books obviously are set in New York, but when you actually write the book after you've done your research, do you write it in New York, or do you get away like most writers do, looking for a quiet getaway? And then the second question is, what are you currently reading? Any favorite authors?
Oh, yeah, sure. So I have an apartment in New York City on the Upper West Side where I've been for a long time, and I have an office there. So I do most of my writing there. With historical fiction, you have so many reference books with you that I can't go work in a coffee shop. I'd have to take up half the space. So I tend to work there. And then I did, right before COVID, thank goodness, I bought a little farmhouse out here in South Salem. So that's where I retreat to as much as I can in the summer, which is so nice. It's really beautiful, and it was perfect during COVID to be able to get away and go there. And yeah, some of the books I love, or the authors I love, include Geraldine Brooks, whose Horse is fantastic. Sarah Waters is a great writer with great plot twists. I've always been very influenced by Edith Wharton and Agatha Christie, of course. There's a book out right now by an author named Brendan Slocum. It's called The Violin Conspiracy. I see people nodding. So it's The Violin Conspiracy, violin. And it's about a story of a black musician whose very priceless violin gets stolen, and he has to track it down. And it's written by a guy who is a classical musician. And so the way he writes about music and the tension of the story and this missing violin, it's just beautifully written. And he really, jumped on the scene. And his second book just got a great review in the New York Times. So I'd highly recommend it. Well, I want to thank Elm Street Books for selling books today. They have been amazing. And thank you to Anthony and the staff of the library for having me here. It's such a wonderful resource, and thank you for supporting your local bookstore, your local library. They're just the heartbeats of the community, and it's been a real pleasure to chat with you. And I'm happy to sign more books, so come on over. Thank you.